Hello again, everyone, and welcome to topic 2 and a further dive into a critical theory approach using a specific research paper, this time by Cannella from 1999, so a little bit of an older paper, but a briefer one, a shorter one than the previous reading by Johnson. And Cannella introduces a lot of really quite provocative ideas in her short paper. Yes, it is focused on early childhood education, same as Johnson, but I think it's interesting that there are some really interesting critical theorists working in the early childhood space, but both articles, both readings from last topic and this topic, both I think are highly relevant to any teacher's work and understanding, because both of them really question some really foundational assumptions embedded in education discourse and how we think about the work of teachers and what teachers do based on these assumptions or taken for granted. So I'm going to explore Cannella's paper and elaborate a bit more, because Cannella's own research has found its way very much into my thesis, and I'll be exploring and extrapolating a little bit of my own research in regards to, I guess, troubling, or what we call problematizing, some of the scientific or quasi-scientific approaches to education. Now, if you're a science teacher or scientifically minded person, I do not wish to, criticize your worldview. The idea here in this approach, and certainly what the approach that Cannella takes, is looking at the ways in which the dominant approach that a scientific worldview has taken on education, the effects of that. So that's the realm to explore. It's not that either Cannella or certainly myself dislike a scientific worldview. In fact, I think science and the methods that have evolved out of a scientific approach in education has certainly had lots of positive effects. But I think seeing it as simply being only of positive value is far too simplistic, and the situation is much more complex than that. And I think if like anything in life, if we're too far weighted in one perspective, we don't see the fact that there are multiple points of view, there are multiple ways of looking at things, multiple perspectives, and by perhaps looking at something from a different perspective, being able to see, in a way, it objectively, and being able to, because that's what scientists argue, is let's stand back, let's look at what is going on. And as a scientist, if you are that way inclined, if you're able to step outside of your own worldview and actually see, well, what effect is this having? And certainly what effects do a dominant scientific approach to the child, to education, the way we structure and organize education, what effects does that have? I think is a benefit, and in your own development as a teacher, in the way in which you analyze what is happening in schools, student learning, your own practice. I think that kind of approach is very beneficial. So in terms of the work that Cannella has done in her paper, I think she really does criticize or bring into question these conventional models of psychology and philosophy and how they've dominated our educational thinking. What kinds of practices have they created? They're very specific and tend to be a narrow set of theoretical assumptions. It's a specific arrangement of knowledge and a mode of thinking that has created a truth about the child. That's what Cannella's argument is, a particular kind of model of the child. And certainly universities that prepare teachers, and Curtin University is no exception, what is considered as valid or relevant about the child, about students, about schools, about yourself as a developing teacher, tends to follow a kind of scientific or quasi-scientific approach to discovering certain answers. So Cannella has argued that education has been virtually constructed by and with these assumptions of psychology and the medical sciences. So the learner is known to teachers by testing, examination, by categorization, and then appropriate experiences are then prescribed to them. So once we diagnose the problem, much like a scientist will diagnose the problem at hand and discover the criteria with which to approach the problem, the same can be said for education. So there is a diagnosis that goes on, and certainly when we talk about assessment, diagnostic assessment does that. It tests and works out what is happening, and then the particular experiences, learning experiences, are thusly prescribed to the learner in order to create the experience of education. And, you know, this certainly legitimizes the belief that science can reveal what younger human beings are like, that they learn in various stages, that there is a linear progression from from non-understanding to understanding, or having a lack of skill to acquiring skill, and that teachers respond according to that linear model. They shape their practices in response to that model. And, you know, Cannella very much argues that the scientific notion of the child, how the child has been categorized, defined, who they are, what they do, and how they learn, that's been fully accepted. It largely goes unquestioned, and it dominates teachers' practice and has done for a long time. And certainly universities shape the ways in which we tell you what the learner is. And when you've done some learning theory, that's what essentially the unit is. It says this is how children learn, and there are various models and approaches, but they're all based on science. And certainly psychology has come to dominate our thinking about learning and defining the learner. And, you know, there's a host of assumptions here that are tied up in how we define the learner. So just wanted to overview some of these assumptions, and that some of them you would think, well, of course they're assumptions, that's how the world works. But I think seeing them as potentially, again, what are the dangerous effects if we adhere to these assumptions? So certainly, human nature as a constant, uniform, and predictable entity. So there's we can apply certain regularities, laws. We can search for those laws in human nature. In regards to certainly, there is a stable, coherent self, or that, particularly when we work with young people, that we help them, teachers help young people coalesce their stable, coherent self. So you often hear teachers talk about, that students can be immature or unruly, but that through the work that we do with them, we can cohere them into somebody who can be reasonably coherent and stable, and thus able to leave schooling and gain employment, for example. So teachers work at kind of bolting on a set of machinery in regards to learning that can create this stable, coherent entity that is the person, that has a particular nature, that has set itself and thus able to have an identity in their lives, and as they gain jobs and employment or go into further learning. So this this idea then that the concept of change, thinking, learning, and the mind, they exist unproblematically. So I just want to talk about this briefly. So let's just and for yourself, you may need to play a little bit of a mind game here, a thinking game, and just sort of unhinge maybe these assumptions and just think about this notion of the mind, for example. Think about the mind as a problem, not as, oh, let me work it out as a problem, but the way in which you consider your human mind as based on certain assumptions. I want you to problematize that. I want you to think, how has that been made up? How have we created, what stories have we told about the human mind? How have we assembled certain truths about the person? How have we created a certain way of being human? And it certainly, if we think about the way that we considered the human 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, when there have been huge changes in, yes, scientific progress about understanding the human body and the mind and the ways in which they interact. But if we think about it in terms of, okay, this is a potential problem, the human mind as it's being constructed for us and by us as something that we can problematize and go, hang on a minute. If this is constructed, if we've told a certain story about the human mind as, say, existing, as I mentioned, as a stable entity over a period of time, does that do certain things to us? Does that have certain effects? And I think the answer is yes, it does. It has very specific effects, and particularly around the emotions, the human emotions as being seen as in a certain way, and how we view our emotions and we label them, and the ways in which science has told us we have particular emotions and they have particular responses in the human body, for example, but really how made up some of that stuff really is. And a good example, I guess, would be something like anger, and human anger as we label, okay, anger is this, and the more you think about that, the more you think about, well, what is anger and how do we define it, it sort of all becomes undone, and you work out that anger is not the same for everybody, and anger is different in different contexts and means different things to different people and triggers certain other kinds of responses. And the kind of simple reductionist label that we've given to that emotion is that it's a simple reductionist label. And that's just one example. And when you begin to kind of tease out other aspects of the human, you begin to see them as labels, and you begin to see them as things that we've constructed and made up to create a kind of story about human beings that provides perhaps some easy answers. But when you start to unpick these answers, you realize that there's more complexity and variation than it would first appear to be. So I think when we begin to think about the learner as being constructed in particular ways, it's a similar story. We have to, and this is what Cannella is arguing, is that if education is being constructed along these models, we need to perhaps trouble this stuff and start to consider, well, what are the effects, and what do these assumptions do? So if these models of psychology and biology, if they've come to inform education and the literature that surrounds the child or the learner or teacher practice, if there's some kind of universal condition to the child, and then there's the teacher's role in that process, if they're founded on these assumptions and predetermined notions of truth and progress, if we can describe these phenomena, if we can measure them and quantify them, if we can account for them systematically, what spaces do these create? They create certain kinds of spaces in which some practices are valorized over others, And you can certainly see that happening at the moment, where testing and standardized testing certainly adheres to these notions of a predetermined universal progress of learning, and that we can test for that, we can account for that. And NAPLAN has that embedded, that assumption embedded throughout it, in terms of the bands of progress and levels, etc. Just the fact that we test them at different ages, and what effects does this then have on the ways in which teachers practice and certain practice are legitimized? So you see this in the political discourse, that a return to a more didactic, a more formalized, a more direct form of teaching. That certainly is very popular in Southeast Asia, a kind of approach that encourages learning for the test and for students to achieve well in testing. So that gets valorized, that gets legitimized, because it's the kind of outcomes that teachers are working towards. So if that's seen as being the ultimate goal of teacher practice, so rather than seeing education as a social good, it becomes an economic good founded on the learner being able to achieve certain outcomes. Again, what are the effects that has on students, and is that alienating? Is that creating certain conditions by which young people are either opting out as they get older? They realize that they don't want to play this game anymore, and they opt out, which is certainly occurring, and in lower socioeconomic schools that's happening a lot. But also, what are the effects on young people themselves in terms of the fact that they are required to perform in step with this linear model that we've set out as educators and as the school system for them? So they need to progress in a timely manner. So you look at this with the fact that we have year 8, year 9, year 10, year 11. So we're expecting a young person to progress in a 12-month period in a certain way. And there are certain, in the Australian curriculum, there's certain achievement outcomes that are badged along each year level. Now, if you yourself have children, or you've grown up with siblings, or if you've had any contact, I hope, with young people and understand the way in which they learn and evolve, there is some linearity, but there is also things that are nowhere near linear, and there is a kind of backwards and forwards approach, or an iterative and moving backwards and forwards. And for some young people, and I've certainly taught them, thinking about their learning over a 12-month period is far too simplistic, and it can take years before young people demonstrate the kinds of incremental learning that we are setting for them. And it's, for me, I see it much more as a kind of a networked approach to learning rather than the straightforward line. But again, if you've watched the Ken Robinson video, Changing Education Paradigms, it was in MTS500. If you did that unit, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. Google Ken Robinson, Changing Education Paradigms, and he talks about the way in which schools are engineered according to these linear assumptions about batching kids by their date of manufacture, and that it's like a factory, and that's where our system has evolved from, and we still haven't broken free from that, despite there is a wealth of evidence suggesting that young people learn at different rates, and two kids from in the same year level can be wildly different in terms of their ability, the ways in which they learn, etc. But we badge them according to some of these assumptions based on kind of a modernist approach that has dominated our thinking in the 20th and 21st century about the human. So again, I think a critical theory approach can provide us some ways in which we can approach this material and think about things and how they've been arranged, and the assumptions that underlie the approach to the child, and how we consider teaching practice. And I think Cannella does a very good job of arguing this in terms of the effects and the potential for us to think a different way about the child, and question these linear models, question these assumptions, these taken for granted. Again, I just want to stress that I'm not here to fire shots at science and a scientific worldview, far from it. I think science does offer us a great deal of really, really important knowledge in regards to education. And again, thinking about Finland, the way in which they have used a scientific evidence-based approach to teacher education, but also to schooling has yielded immense benefits. But they also work in other approaches as well. And certainly a sociological approach comes in very much with a lot of the way in which they engineer their schooling environments as well. So, I think the multiple perspective approach is really important, and not being dominated by one or the other, or seeing the ways, the effects a particular dominant approach has had on schooling, on teaching practice, and the way in which we see the child and the learner. I think understanding and coming to terms with that is really important. So again, I hope this has been an interesting little mini lecture for you, an interesting approach to some of these critical theoretical papers. And if it's the first time that you have engaged with this kind of theory, it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but I hope it's just raised some questions for you and started to give you a little bit of a different analytical perspective that you may never have had. And certainly for education, I think this is a very valuable way in which you can move forward and examine the work of teaching. And certainly when you start to move into schools and have these questions in the back of your mind as you start to see the ways in which teachers work and describe their work and define themselves as professionals, the ways in which they work with students and so forth, and how schools are engineered. I think it's very important. And it's not necessarily that you need to be voicing all of these opinions and concerns and issues in schools. In fact, teachers may look at you a bit funny and think, why are they here questioning everything we're doing? It's more, again, that's working in the back of your mind. And as you observe, certainly as you approach the assessment for assessment 2, as you watch and observe what's going on in schools, these things should be working with you and working for you rather than making things more difficult. They should help you digest and understand and move forward in your analysis. So thank you again for engaging.